Yeah, let's start.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Welcome to everyone. A week late. Hope you stayed reasonably warm. Um, uh, as you can see, we're starting at 3:55. That's going to be our standard now because people come from all over the university. You can take that into consideration. The classes will be taped and put up on Canvas in case you didn't hear before, so you don't have to take notes. My name is Yochai Benkler. I teach here at the law school. I focus on law and political economy, and in this probably somewhat different from most of the people Professor Unger over the years has taught this course with, who are mostly economists. And this is very much a conversation and an engagement of ideas. And I very much look forward to the conversation. But Roberto, why don't you?
Good. So the plan is for me to start by talking some 20 minutes about the themes of the course. The primary theme of the course is the alternative futures of the market economy. The background theme of the course is the alternative futures of the study of the economy itself. That will be our main subject next week. Let me, however, now say just a few words about that. Economics, to many people's surprise, is not the study of the economy today. Economics is a study of a method that was developed by the marginalist economists at the end of the 19th century. The application of that method to subjects that have nothing to do with production and exchange is now commonly regarded as economics. And conversely, the study of the economy by some other method, for example, Max Weber's study of the contemporary economy, is not regarded as economics. This is not simply some kind of joke. It is a serious problem, the implications of which we may pursue later. Economics, as it is now conceived, is a limited but powerful discipline, perhaps the most powerful of the social sciences. Every contemporary social science severs the link, the vital link, between insight into the actual and imagination of the possible in a different way. And economics severs it in a unique way because its central method is largely what the Austrian economists described as a form of deductive logic. Economics is very limited, especially very limited for the kind of discussion that we imagine here, but nevertheless indispensable. It now appears on the scene of contemporary intellectual life as the science of constraints and of trade-offs. It presents the bill to the dreamer, and we will have occasion to deal with it soon. The main theme of the course is the alternative futures of the market economy itself, and that's the subject of my brief remarks now. A market economy is a decentralized form of economic life with many agents who are able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The social theorists had a richer idea of the moral character and social background of the market economy. They conceived of it as a simplified form of cooperation among strangers that may be unnecessary when there is high trust, but that is certainly impossible when there is no trust. The cultural and social basis of the market economy, according to many of them, according to thinkers like Max Weber himself or Georg Simmel, was the generalization of a modicum of trust, a low level of trust among strangers, beyond the limits of barriers between insiders and outsiders. It's possible that a more advanced form of production and exchange than we now have established in the world will require a heightening of this level of trust, and that will be a different form of economic life. Now, the first question that arises in the study of the market economy and of its alternative futures is whether it does have or not a single natural and necessary form. The thesis that it has a single natural and necessary form has an extreme variant in an idea that Hayek and his school developed. If Robinson Crusoe traded on his island long enough, the thesis is, he would eventually spontaneously reproduce the entire system of German private law. In other words, it's the idea that spontaneous trade among equals has built in it a natural logic which takes the form of the law and institutions of the European market economies. The idea is not very far from being preposterous, but it is a variant of an idea that is widespread in the world. The single greatest analytical achievement of legal theory in the 19th century and in the first part of the 20th century was the deconstruction of that idea and the demonstration that the market economy has no single natural and necessary form. Even if you conceive of a market economy at the highest level of abstraction, abstracting from all historical details, it has at least two dimensions. One dimension is absolute decentralization, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The other dimension has to do with the degree of control, absolute or not, conditional or unconditional, unified or fragmentary, that each of those agents has over the resources at his disposal. These two dimensions, the dimension of what I'm calling absolute decentralization and the dimension of control of the resources, more or less absolute, do not go automatically together. On the contrary, they interfere with each other. They contradict each other. One of the ways of decentralizing economic initiative may be to restrict the absoluteness or the perpetual character of the control over the resources put at the disposal of the agent by the market. But that's not the main direction that legal thought pursued in its deconstruction of market fundamentalism. It took another direction. In that 100-year period from the beginning of the 150-year period from the beginning of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. The legal theorists showed the following, and these were legal theorists in the mainstream, not leftists, not radicals. They were people like Oliver Wendell Holmes. Legal theory showed that if you start from abstractions like freedom of contract and private property and begin to unpack the agenda of a market economy at greater levels of detail, at each step down the road there will be alternatives. Alternative ways of reaching the next level of detail. And you will not be able to resolve the disputes at that moment of going down to the next level of detail simply by recurring back to the abstract idea of the market and individual property and freedom of contract. It will turn on conflicts of vision and conflicts of interest. You will discover irrepressible variety in the detailed institutional organization of the market order. That simple idea has never fully penetrated to this very day practical economics. The instinct of the economist in general is to suppose that a market is a market, property is property, and contract is contract. The whole direction of legal thought over the 150-year period, however, went in the opposite sense, that there is no intrinsic organization of the market, and property has no natural form, and neither does contract. And that's the legal indeterminacy of the market order became then a major premise of legal thought, but almost never turned into a starting point of economic analysis. Now, in our course, we are going to focus on the long-term future of the market economy, but also its short-term futures. In the long term, the nature of the market order is shaped, on the one hand, by the property regime, and on the other hand, by the nature of technology. The property regime, I just said, has no intrinsic nature. It can take different forms. In most periods of legal history, in most societies, in most legal traditions, the rights that we now identify with ownership have been disaggregated, and their component parts attributed to different economic agents. That was, for example, notably the case in European feudalism. And a comparativist in law would say that the unification of the property right that took place in 19th century legal history and legal thought was, from the standpoint of the history of law, an anomaly. It's not, as it were, the natural form of law. And that will be a major part of our discussion. What in the future can be the form of the property regime, and what is the relation between those two understandings of the market that I stated a moment ago: absolute decentralization and absolute control. The second axis around which the market order has developed over the long term is technology. Now, what is technology? How should we think about technology? We should not think of it as a bunch of gadgets. We should think of it as, on the one hand, the materialization of a channel between our experiments in developing a channel between our experiments with the mobilization of natural forces in our favor, like the electrical force, the magnetic force, the nuclear force, and our experiments in the organization of work, the technical division of labor. In another sense, technology marks the movable frontier between what we have already learned how to repeat and what we have not yet learned how to repeat. Everything that we can express in a formula or an algorithm, we can embody in a mechanical device. And the point of the machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme and, in a sense, our only resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. And this second idea of technology immediately suggests to us that no human being should be condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine. The combination of the evolution of technology with the history of property shapes the market order over the long term. Now, over the medium term, which is crucial to our inquiry here in the course, the evolution of the market order happens around fulcral points, or points of contestation, of conflict. The first of them has to do with the relation between the most advanced form of production in a historical epoch and the rest of the production system, the vanguard and the rest. Karl Marx and Adam Smith both believed that the best way to study an economy and understand its possibilities was to study the most advanced practice of production in the historical epoch, because it is the advanced practice of production that most completely reveals our nature, our vocation, our possibilities. Right now, the advanced practice of production is no longer industry, also called Fordist mass production. The most advanced practice of production is what we have come to call the knowledge economy. The knowledge economy, as we have it in the world, is multi-sectoral. It exists in all the major economies of the world now, in the developing countries as well as in the most advanced countries. But it is insular and exclusive as well as multi-sectoral. It exists in every sector of production, in not just in advanced manufacturing, but in intellectually dense services, and even in precision or scientific agriculture. And indeed, one of the characteristics of the production system in the age of the knowledge economy is the weakening of the distinctions among sectors. What is production in the knowledge economy other than combined services, intellectual services? This insular and socially exclusive character of the knowledge economy, of the contemporary knowledge economy, locking out the great majority of firms and of workers, has momentous consequences. On the one hand, it slows down economic growth, the growth of productivity. How could it not slow it down if it denies to the majority of economic agents the most advanced practices of production? And it deepens inequality by anchoring inequality in the hierarchical segmentation of the production system. The second major point of division, a fulcral point in the evolution of the market order in the middle term, has to do with the relation of labor to capital. The market economy, in principle, would be based on free labor. But what is free labor? In the 19th century, the liberals and socialists alike believed that there were three forms of free labor. There was wage labor, the lowest form, the one which retained many of the characteristics of serfdom and slavery. There was self-employment, and there was cooperation among the self-employed. In the 20th century, the predominance of wage labor as a natural form of free labor came to be universally accepted, which it had never been before. And the main way in which it could be rendered compatible with the experience of free agency was through countervailing power unionization, which now in many contemporary societies survives only in governmental employment or in employment in the philanthropic sector. What is the nature and what is the possible form of free labor under the conditions of today, of today's market? And the third problem is the problem of the relation of finance to the production system or to the real economy. And I can present the problem by making a simple observation. The production system in contemporary economies is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. That observation leads to a disquieting question. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? In principle, finance should be at the service of production, of the productive agenda of society. And the most important form of finance would be the funding of the making of new assets in new ways, which is venture capital. But venture capital, in fact, is a minuscule, a tiny part of the operations of the capital markets. What is it for? What is it about? And by what means can we ensure that finance serves as a good servant rather than being, as it is, a bad master? Now let me show how these divisions come to life in politics and in history. In the world today, most people are not Marx's proletariat, most people in most countries. The industrial labor force, the labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the production system, is a shrinking part of the population, which is seen by the other parts and ultimately comes to see itself as just one more special interest group, rather than what Marx thought they would be, which is the bearer of the universal interests of humanity. Most men and women in most countries in the world today are what you could call a subjective petty bourgeoisie. Their aspiration is to have a small rural property, a store in town, or to master a service for which they can charge a fee. Their aspiration by default is in the end to independent, retrograde family business based on self-exploitation and family saving. That's what most people in the world seem to want today. So that's why you could call them a subjective petty bourgeoisie. The objective petty bourgeoisie, which is the small business class, is a besieged minority in most countries, though often a minority that punches above its weight, as in the United States. But that's a circumstance. Now, in the class societies that exist in the world, this subjective petty bourgeoisie cannot realize its aspiration. If it realized its aspiration, it would be, for the most part, disappointed, because archaic, retrograde, isolated family business is stuck in low productivity. It needs to have allies in the elites if anything is to happen, and in particular if a growth miracle is to happen. The elites in most countries in the world are composed largely of rentiers, if not natural resource rentiers, financial rentiers. It would be necessary for there to form within the national elites a productivist counter-elite, for this productivist counter-elite to seek power, to win power, and then once in power to offer the majority of the subjective petty bourgeoisie alternatives to its default goal of owning and operating small, archaic family business. And then, for that operation, the reimagination and the reorganization of the market order becomes crucial. It is important then to imagine on what terms the knowledge economy for the few could be converted into a knowledge economy for the many. Free labor could become really free, and new life given to the 19th century dream of self-employment. And finance could be brought to serve or made to serve the productive agenda of society rather than being allowed to serve itself. This contemporary dilemma presents itself to us against the background of a remarkable historical fact. And let me call that fact the fact of the lost agenda. The lost agenda was, again, a petty bourgeois agenda. A society of self-employed, small-scale producers. Even today, the major theoreticians, for example, of justice, of distributive justice, like John Rawls, held that welfare state capitalism was inferior to property-owning democracy. They're famous for their ideas about redistribution under welfare state capitalism, but what they valued most was the possibility of the property-owning democracy. Why did that 19th century project fail? In essence, it failed because the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, who were both champions of this idea, were unable to show how it could be made compatible with the aggregation of resources at scale. After the Civil War in the United States, and in the latter part of the 19th century, throughout the advanced North Atlantic societies, the cause of small-scale property was defeated. And it was defeated because the banks, the plutocracy, the corporation presented themselves as necessary to the aggregation of resources demanded by the dominant economy. Those problems have not died. That agenda has a new life. If only we could reinvent the market around these three themes that I have emphasized: the relation of the vanguard to the rest of the production system, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to production. Such is the ambitious program of our course, and I hope that it will be as exciting in its execution as it is demanding.
I'm torn between doing a similar thing and presenting and just engaging in the conversation. No, let me do something. Let me do something a little more structured to give you a sense of the difference of perspective and style. And historically, you've given this course with economists. And what I want to do is essentially clarify a few components of where I come from that I think will create some differences and productive tensions. So the first thing is this question of what is political economy as opposed to economics, at least from my perspective as I see it, and it'll be interesting to have that conversation. So from the very beginning, we start with the idea of individuals pursuing their own self-interests as the core of market, this radical decentralization. I think political economy instead looks at social relations, at roles that are structured institutionally that are inherited from prior rounds of conflict over institutions. There's no abstract moment. We always inherit institutions from prior rounds. There's no moment of radical invention, which means actually we don't focus on free choices and consensual exchange. That's never been the actual story of any market. But rather, we see social relations set by imperatives and constraints through socially enforced habituated practices, whether through law, whether through custom, whether through smaller scale organizational strategies. And again, here of course we agree there's no human nature prior to history, but all we have is actually historically specific practices and relations that produce consciousness, that produce a way of thinking about the world, that produce, as you will, a subjective petit bourgeoisie through an imagination of what some other life would be in this. Crucially here, this idea of radically decentralized consensual exchanges is a myth. It does not exist. It has never existed as a broad scale. It is not what characterizes capitalism. What characterizes capitalism is far more, I agree, the ritual enactment of the pretense of agreement to what is in fact the playing out of structured social relations inherited from prior rounds over which we have little control except through mobilization for political action and change. And this is true for employment, for credit, for housing, for healthcare, for education, for basic infrastructure, for media and culture. As we think about the near future and the present future, crucial to me, the questions of political economy is an analysis of what explains the actual structures that exist. And then when we look both at historical variation and at our projected future, anticipated and desired variation, what is the institutional history and what are the institutional components that lead to different practices? What is systematically similar about some places? What is systematically different about some places? There's, you can think of it as a form of comparative political economy, although I think that form has been too meso-level and detailed in its analysis, but we can talk about that as we go. So that's the first one. When I say political economy, in what way is it different from economics? It's in this way of understanding the inherited institutional structure, that structure inherited social relations that dramatically shape how life goes for most people in a society. The second word we haven't said, and I think you think it doesn't mean much, but I'm going to try to make it mean much, which is capitalism. And this is another thing that we'll talk about, is what might one mean about it? What are its dynamics? And essentially, I will be working from a presumption that there is something useful about thinking about what is a dynamic that is shared across the very different kinds of market societies that there are in the world, with very different patterns of productivity, of inequality, of growth, and that capitalism is a form of social life that characterizes modernity, that is driven by near universal market reach, essentially with three core components. The first is market dependence for subsistence. For the first time, historically, most people in a given society live in households, or nearly all people live in households, that depend on commodity exchange, on buying stuff through exchange, for a price, with people who are not related to them in any form of kinship or customary order to meet their basic subsistence needs. It is this that forces everybody to try to find a way to make money, either through petty commodity production, or through wage labor. But it is this that forces everyone to instrumentalize their work and their relations in order to keep body and soul together. The second is market dependence for production. This is the far more commonly known. It's the idea that people who organize production depend on commodity exchange, depend on the ability to buy in markets, what they need in order to continue to be organizers of production and not fall into the condition of wage labor, and the only thing they have to sell is their labor. And that means they have to acquire labor as a commodity in the market. They have to acquire knowledge in the market, whether through hiring people with embodied knowledge, whether through using tools and technology, which I see as congealed practical knowledge embedded in material culture. That is to say, the knowledge of how to convert nature into the satisfaction of human needs and wants, embedded in material culture, in the machine, in the tool. And to do this over time and subject to contingency, which is where credit and finance come in. And all of these require the ability to pay for them in order to stay in business, and it's that requirement that forces businesses to remain sufficiently profitable, where the sufficiently part comes from what they requires in order to get the credit they need in order to continue to operate. The third component that characterizes capitalist societies or capitalist states is market dependence for protection. Again, for the first time in history, it starts a little bit in Venice and Genoa, then in the Dutch Republic, then in England, and from there it moves to the rest of the world, is that the political military formations for the first time depend on selling debt into financial markets and selling and taxing market transactions to be able to attach their fiscal capacity to the market dynamism of their society. The first capitalist states that did so, the Dutch Republic, England, Britain, then the United States, have been the global hegemons for the last 450 years. And in the 19th century, a range of countries that began their early modern state existence as absolutist states imposed a series of revolutions from above to change their society into one that could sustain expanding market and financial markets in order to sell debt. This continues to mean that for the first time, the profit-reaping elites, the elites whose power comes from being rich, from being in the profit-reaping sectors, become important, if not dominant, in the consideration of political military needs. Whereas in prior society, either political military position translated into riches, or ecclesiastic position in social relations of meaning-making was translated into political military and economic. It was church and state. And this, for the first time, transformed the role of the profit-reaping classes in shaping the direction of where the political military classes, formations. It's the conjunction of these two, of market dependence for subsistence and market dependence for production, that is the precondition to market dependence for protection. You cannot shift to market dependence for protection before you have a society in which the imperatives of market force everyone, as individuals in households and as organizers of production and enterprises, to continuously increase their profit, to be able to latch yourself onto something like that. What these things do together is create what I call the Red Queen dynamic. The Red Queen says to Alice, this is, here you have to, it takes all the running you can do just to stay in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you have to run twice as fast. And that's essentially what happens in the context of pervasive market economy. You cannot continue to, this is what causes the phenomenon of the corporations squeezing out the small producers is the ability to attract the financial capital in order to grow it and to drown the potential competing markets in the core economies, except in places, we'll talk about Sheffield, we'll talk about Lyon, except in places where there were sufficient institutional constraints to limit that. But the drive is one that the most profitable enterprises succeed in overcoming the others. It is this incessant pursuit of profit that gives us the transformation of technological change. The takeoff of dramatic, continuous technological change going to Schumpeter is not competition, but the escape of competition. It's the pursuit of power to be a price maker rather than a price taker that drives the incessant change of technological change. As each wave of technological change is driven precisely at the frontier by those enterprises that succeed in escaping from what others know how to do to maintain profit, so that when others keep up, catch up, and learn, and the knowledge diffuses, usually in cycles of about 50 to 70 years, the escape, capital starts to look, finance starts to look for who is able to escape from that, who is able to do things in new ways so that they have pricing power to create quasi-ways. And that's what keeps driving. But profit is indifferent to whether it comes from a bigger pie with the same share or from a bigger share of a slow-growing pie. Ideally, from the perspective of the business, it will be more productive and grow the pie and be more powerful and grab a bigger share. But as between the two, it's indifferent. The question is what's more profitable. And this we get from Thorstein Veblen and from the idea of business sabotage. The idea that you can change the structure of production in ways that increase profitability by knocking the knees out from your competitors, by finding labor that is more squeezable, by finding consumers who are more relevant, by squeezing suppliers, by finding a bottleneck that allows you to squeeze more rather than be more productive. But Veblen also is even more famous for his concept of conspicuous consumption, where the idea that what we're doing is increasing the satisfaction of needs and wants ignores the fact that in fact what we're seeing is a continuous profit-oriented reshaping of needs and wants for profit. There is no external, here's what we need and want. There is also always internal shaping of meaning in order to make us want more. So to be a little more concrete, we talk about the most advanced practice or you talked about the most advanced practice of production. Here we are in the Industrial Revolution, the two major images. Arkwright's Walker frame, allegedly the first factory, allegedly because it isn't. It's about 17 years after the first purpose-built factory, employing hundreds of women and children, primarily children. And Crompton spinning. These two technologies both dramatically increase the quantity that could be spun, reducing within the span of a decade the number of hours it took to spin 100 kilograms of cotton from 50,000 to 2,000, and then within another decade down to 300. Dramatically increasing quantity, but with a big difference. Two differences. One, the mule was vastly finer and increased rapidly with how fine. So it could spin a lot more and finer cotton from the same amount of raw cotton. The water frame didn't require a lot of skill. The water frame could employ women and children who by tradition had lower wages. The mule was heavy and required skill and quickly turned spinning from women's work in the home to men's work in workshops. The spinners quickly unionized. And for about a period of 15 years, you have the mule outperforming technically, but the water frame continuing to be the more profitable model because the quality difference was not sufficient to squeeze out the water. After about 15 years, even the big manufacturers like Robert Peel, the son, had to give up on the water frame and move to sets of mules. It's not just an old story. Because what is the most advanced practice manufacturing today? Artificial intelligence and the use of automated workplace surveillance and management. What do we see? This is from last year OECD comparison cross-country. We see that American firms, 72% use automated workplace. There's a lot less of a difference, 90 to 67% in overall monitoring. But Europeans mostly use it for checking card. You came into work, you didn't come into work. Things like monitoring the speed of work, sanctioning poor performance, vast differences between different institutional frameworks, reflecting precisely the inherited institutional differences between these different sectors. And so what we get is that the same logic that applies to technology, there are productivity-seeking changes, there are power-seeking changes, gets played out across multiple dimensions of potential obtaining of power. Most important, of course, law and the restructuring of law to strengthen or weaken labor is a major domain of struggle, which distinguishes. I will upload all of these to the website. You don't need to take photos of them. There's productivity-seeking legal change, but also rent-seeking legal change. There's jurisdictional arbitrage that is played out in the effort, and we see it a lot today in terms of offshoring and locating production where labor is weakest. There is also, however, stabilization. This is Polanyi's double movement. There are ways in which there's political struggle over stabilization, which, when the historical struggles over these differentiate, you get very different frameworks from the Nordic social democracies to some of the more unequal states in the United States. A major dimension of struggle over power has been around atavistic status subordination and the leveraging of status subordinated underclasses, whether racialized, whether leveraging, as we saw in the case of the water frame, gendered division of labor and social relations in production translated into social relations of production. We also have seen, not only in colonialism, but to this day, the deployment of global military hegemonic force to impose asymmetric terms of trade in different countries as a component of, and this is a lot easier to understand today than it might have been 10, 15 years ago. And finally, we get to the point, Roberto, that you ended with, that Professor Unger ended with, which is financialization. The escape from stabilization constraints, the escape from successful building of power by labor to change the terms of trade into the making of profit by investing in financial products that are pure redistribution between the lucky and unlucky, between the sophisticated and the naive, and more often than not, between the marks and the sharks, where you have these cycles of speculative finance and Ponzi finance that draw finance away from productive finance. So continuing on the clash between finance and real economy production, but to my taste, more focused on the crowding out of the profitability of finance for its own sake and its ability to escape any of the constraints of stabilization, as opposed to this question of rentiers as opposed to the productivist capitalists. All of which leaves us with a world of opposites, with enormous scientific advance, but also deep skepticism now and anomie and loss of faith in the context of set of governance. And to me, one of the things, in addition to thinking about the future, or thinking about the future also in the context of the struggles, the actual struggles and dynamics of power and forces constraining what made the past what it was, what makes the current variation that we do see and the variation we don't see exist or not exist, and what that teaches us about what we can do.
So it seems that you think that there is this mechanism, which you call capitalism, which has a logic of it spreads throughout the economy. But now let's focus on this historical fact, which helped form the historical personality of the United States, the organization of 19th century agriculture in America in the period between independence and the Civil War. The Americans were presented with a thesis in which the leftists and the conservatives agreed that the English dynamic of agrarian concentration was inevitable and was supposedly an intrinsic feature of capitalism. Peasants driven out of the land into the towns to become the labor force of industry. They rejected that. They formed the most efficient system of family-scale agriculture that had ever existed in the world up to that point.
Your microphone is off.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe it's actually the...
You're fine.
Okay. So the Americans rejected...
I was the one who wasn't being recorded, actually, so it turns out.
The Americans rejected the inevitability of the English dynamic of agrarian concentration, which the Marxists and the conservatives felt to be intrinsic to capitalism. They organized the most efficient system of family-scale agriculture that ever existed, and they established what in today's vocabulary we would describe as decentralized strategic coordination between the government and the local farmer. Family-scale agriculture has a unique set of problems, threats, because it combines price volatility or susceptibility to economic instability with climate volatility or susceptibility to physical instability. So there had to be price supports, there had to be food stockpiles, and among them, among the independent family farmers, cooperative competition. They cooperated, including cooperated in labor, in working on one another's farms to achieve economies of scale. This was an invention. It was a collective invention. Now, that was part of a situation in which, when Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s, 1 in every 5 white men worked for another white man. So was that economy of self-employed, small-scale producers a capitalist economy, in your sense, or not?
So this is great, because the national reformers, the movement of New York labor advocates that introduced what would end up being the Homestead Act of 1862 that produced the reform that you're describing, were very specifically New York labor advocates. They were concerned about the reproduction on the East Coast of English conditions of industrial labor, and they intervened specifically with the intent of using the vast wealth of the not yet fully conquered West in order to prevent the emergence of capitalism in America by creating access to landless settlers to have direct access to the means of subsistence. So this is a reform that is specifically aimed at preventing the effect of enclosure, that the parliamentary enclosure had in Britain. In fact, Galusha-Grow, I'm sorry, I'm doing this because I literally just lectured on it 2 hours ago. Galusha-Grow ended up becoming the first Republican Speaker of the House. In 1852, in the House, he's speaking specifically in terms of how enclosure created the monopoly in land, which is what forced people into wage labor, which was dependent, and specifically talked about family-level homesteading in terms of preventing the capture of capital by labor. He talks about, in the battle between capital and labor, is it the role of government to stand on the side of the rich and the powerful against sweat? He talks specifically about how law, it is the responsibility of those who make law when they create conditions under which the land speculator can get the land early. It's essentially transferring money into the capitalist's hands. So they existed in a capitalist system where much of the land was being purchased by land speculators. They were specifically introducing this reform in order to prevent market dependence for subsistence from forcing people into wage labor. And so I agree with you that that's an incredible innovation in the United States.
Is it capitalism?
It is intended in its original form to resist capitalism. The actual story ends up being one where when these family farms get connected to railroads as they arrive, when railroads and steamships integrate the American Midwest and the American Midwest into the European growing grain market, displacing Prussia, they end up shifting production from subsistence to grain for export. Once they do that, they become dependent on the grain elevators and the banks and the railroads for access to credit for the growing cycle, access to storage so that they don't all dump at the same time at harvest, and access to carriage. And that's what you have, this massive set of conflicts between the Midwestern states, the Granger laws that tried to create public utility laws for the granaries, for the railroads, the efforts
against the populists who tried to redirect it, right?
No, the populists are trying to decommodify access to credit. So they're saying, let's have a sub-treasury. Instead of commercial granaries, let's have federal granaries that will decommodify the means of production. What is the means of production in this case? Storage and credit. They want the sub-treasury where the government will own storage facilities, will give them 80% of the expected price in advance so they don't have to depend on credit, and then pay to them the actual difference at the end. But they're explicitly, in the Orsala program in 1892, they specifically tried to introduce institutional details intentionally intended to disrupt market dependence for credit, market dependence for grain. They want nationalization of the railroads because they won't want to be dependent for transportation. They are strategically trying to disrupt the components of capitalism. They end up losing either in Congress or in the Supreme Court, or usually both. But that has to do with the fact that you are in a capitalist system, you're trying to resist it and fight against it, and you keep losing the legal battles. And
what is gained intellectually by calling it capitalism?
What is gained is a systematic understanding of what are the elements you need to face. Why was it important? You can say, oh, they did granaries, they did railroads, they did this, they did that, but you don't understand why those are the strategic places where you need to change. To me, if you have a systematic view of how the dynamics that are squeezing and instrumentalizing life are layered as subsistence and production, what the components of production are, how law shapes them, how market dependence is what forces you into these practices that you don't want, then you can identify the targets, the specific targets for transformation.
No, it seems to me a tactical question to call that capitalism or not. So there are these right-wing movements. There's a right-wing plutocratic populism in the world in many countries, including the United States. One thing that's remarkable about it is that it has no program in political economy other than to close down migration and adopt an identity politics of the majority against the identity politics of the minorities. But it has no project. Take, for example, a theme that came up in my remarks at the outset about technology. Now let me give it a little more concreteness. Suppose this contrast between two programs for the evolution of technology. I claimed in my remarks that technology has no intrinsic logic of evolution. But one could say there are two logics of evolution they can imagine. One is characterized by the following. The early stages, you develop technology in a form that can be appropriated by big firms who have the liquid capital to internalize these technologies. Then you take automation, the replacement of labor, to be in the middle term, the guiding goal. And finally, for the future, you take as your directive the idea of general artificial intelligence. In other words, the idea of forming a machine which is a proxy for the human mind and that is as close as possible to the human mind. Now, there is an alternative. The alternative would say at the beginning, you prioritize the capacity of the technologies to be assimilated by the small-scale producers and by the individual economic agents. Now, in every country in the world, a large part of the population has no stable relations to any business enterprise. They're independent agents. And the objective with respect to that mass of individual economic agents is to transform them into technologically equipped artisans with higher productivity. The nurse practitioner doing what the doctor can do. The machine repairman becoming a technologist and so forth. In the middle term, you reject the primacy of automation and you say the primary objective is not to replace the worker, but to equip him, to increase his powers. And in the future, as the guiding objective, you reject the idea of artificial natural intelligence, and you say the objective is not to form a simulacrum of the human mind. The objective is to form a machine, to build a machine that is completely different from the human mind, but that excels in the powers that we human beings lack. It has certain computational powers, and we are able to use it to do what we are best at, which is imagination, vision, not power. Now, so you have two logics of evolution. Both of them can exist in market form. One of them we have reason to prefer to the other. Are they not? What's their relation to the concept of capitalism? It's just confusing.
The question is, if you had to predict which of these two trajectories,
one is much easier to happen than the other. One is much easier to happen than the other. Does that make it capitalism? That is, why is it, going back to my political observation about the right, why is there no right-wing party in the world now, none in Europe, that has a productivist project? You take countries like Spain, which are relatively egalitarian compared to other European societies or contemporary societies. It has right-wing parties, but the right-wing parties don't present a petty bourgeois project.
No, they don't. But if you actually
nor do they present a project for technology. They have no project. So it's the left that should present their project.
So let's break it up. There's several things going on here. First, on the question of right-wing parties. Right-wing parties are a function of successful leveraging of popular politics coupled with an oligarchic element that is not actually trying to have a project that changes anything, but rather keeps things. And we have a current institutional framework that works perfectly well for a tiny portion of the population, and it's creating dramatic social dislocation for vast majorities of working people of all classes across the most advanced societies. So what you're getting is a lot of social dislocation. What the right-wing parties are doing is displacing that anger onto identity, so that those people can't actually then turn around and say, why is it that you have trillion-dollar pay packages or multi-billion-dollar pay packages, let alone just purely in finance that doesn't actually produce jobs? It's in order to prevent the emergence of a productivist strategy that you want to actually give the working classes someone to hate as a way of supporting you. So you wouldn't expect them to have an economic program. You'd expect them to have a program that deflects attention from change under conditions where the existing oligarchic elites actually are gaining and are winning just fine. The second part is, the real part, I think, that you're right, is why don't left-wing parties have a productivist agenda and that politics?
For their traditional enemies, including the small business class.
So again, there are these two separate questions. One is whether the productivist strategy needs to be specifically emphasizing the working class, or whether it can be agnostic between
Which working class? You
the
mean
skilled working class, the semi-skilled working class, and the petty and the smallholders, the petty bourgeoisie, as you call them. So what you're describing as the subjective petty bourgeoisie, what I would think of as the semi-skilled, skilled working class, and perhaps the racialized underclass. I have no particular attachment.
In the American vocabulary, they're sometimes described as the uncredentialed part of the working class. Those are the ones who are supporting the right-wing parties and movements.
Precisely because in order to deflect their attention from what is actually causing their misery, they get deflected into hatred. That's not a new strategy for the right.
Yes,
There's a reason that it was the 20s and 30s that fascism rose in Europe as it did. It was precisely
one reason
devastation.
is that the left parties drove the lower middle class, the mass of people, into the hands of the fascists by demonizing them and electing them as the main enemies.
I am not going to stand here and tell you that the main enemies of the working class are the smallholder producers, or what you're calling the petty bourgeoisie.
No, because the majority of them aren't actually small-scale producers. That's why I insist on calling them the subjective petty bourgeoisie. They're not part of a small business class.
Let's again try to clarify. Who do you see the left as rejecting in this model? What are they doing in life today?
What are they doing in life? They're presenting themselves on the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. They're sugarcoating. When Bernie Sanders defends 1970s Sweden as the goal for the United States, that's exactly what he's doing.
Why does it have to be 1970s Sweden as opposed to 2026 Sweden and Denmark? Which is a very different story.
Contemporary Sweden is much less convincing for someone who thinks that way.
But contemporary Sweden is an actual real world example. Contemporary Denmark is an actual real world production of a rapidly growing which is far from a super equal country, but with far better equality.
Entitlements. It's a country owned, half of the country is owned by one family.
Okay, what example anywhere do you have of the model you see as clearly superior to the success to Denmark and Sweden?
That's not how we can think.
Okay.
We can't think by saying, here's the wave of the future. That's the way in which the left has thought in the 20th century. There is no wave of the future. The wave of the future is in every country, in particular movements. There's not one country that represents the wave.
The question is, what constraints, what forces do you see operating as effective constraints on the implementation of programs? And where do they come from, these forces? Do they exist, or is it just a failure of imagination?
They come from the current distribution of assets, of endowments, of capabilities, both political and economic.
Great. So what differentiates societies in terms of the distribution of assets? Kinds of education and different patterns of education and lifelong learning, kinds of access to credit and the availability of development type credit, types of infrastructure and access to infrastructure. These are the components that you want to try to address as you're building into the future.
Everything. So Franklin Roosevelt had as his allies the greatest war in human history up to that point, World War II, and the greatest economic collapse, the Depression of the 1930s. And even then, he had trouble. He had trouble because the American Constitution was designed to give him trouble and to create a perpetual motion machine that would inhibit the transformation of society by politics. And then later on, the Americans discovered during the present episode that their constitution is relatively easy to be taken over by a South American-style caudillo. And its importation into South America has demonstrated that even more.
This I won't argue with you. Let's turn back a little bit to this question of the frontier of technology that you were talking about. What do you count as inside the frontier, and what do you count as outside? Let me ask the following question. So I raised the point about automated workplace management and surveillance as a character of the most advanced workplaces today. You see and in some places, it's the highest applications are in trucking and app services where you have pervasive surveillance in order to push productivity, but at the expense of the people actually doing the work, losing autonomy, losing ability. That's clearly in that framework, although I assume you would say that's not the knowledge economy, that's the application of the knowledge economy to those who are abused by it or controlled by it. You see in the development of AI, you see the reinforcement learning human feedback workers in India, the Philippines, the United States, but also across much of Africa, large concentrations in Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria very large. How do you define the line between those aspects that are integral to these productive processes, creating the most cutting-edge AI, that are hyper-exploitative, and those that are most creative? Is it the knowledge economy issue, Or is it that you say that everyone should have work that gives them meaning and creativity? But then it's not the most, but then you're not looking at the actual frontier models of production, the way they're actually organized and structured.
I mentioned 3 stages. The later stages begin in the earlier stages. The first thing is the creation of technology in the form that is easiest to assimilate by these big firms with vast amounts of liquid capital. And the Americans identify the knowledge economy with the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley, which are in fact not characteristic of the knowledge economy, but are an anomaly with several characteristics: the universality of the platforms, the near zero marginal cost of adding a customer to the platform, and the gap, the accidental, as it were, gap in the law of intellectual property, which allows them to have a business model based on trafficking in a free commodity, which is the data of their customers. All of that. It's an anomaly. So they're rent-seeking oligopolies with these platforms of theirs. That's not the knowledge economy. That is a form of the knowledge economy, but a very special corner of the knowledge economy with all these special characteristics.
Bracket now what my basic position is, that that's actually not the exception. That's the normal structure that capitalism drives towards, and it's precisely by refusing to see that as an internal dynamic that's about creating power in order to extract profit as the normal outcome of market society that I resist. But I'm less interested in that now, because we'll have opportunities in a couple of weeks, and more interested in, tell me a story about who is the knowledge economy that is also the most advanced practice of production in your view.
What do you mean?
You're saying it's not Silicon Valley.
There are all these advances, but the advances are all shaped by this particular direction that goes from large firms to the goal of automation and to the ultimate objective of general artificial intelligence. What I'm claiming is that that direction is not necessary. There's nothing in the intrinsic nature of technology that would compel that. The people who control the country want that, for sure. But that doesn't come from the technology. That comes from them.
Nothing comes from the technology. That's the whole point of trying to show the difference between Europe and the US, is to emphasize that nothing is technologically determined. It's all about how the it's a techno-institutional framework and how it's phrased. The question is, what are the forces that are pushing some to become dominant and some not dominant? That's the question.
What is it that determines the technology? Taking one direction rather than another.
And my argument is that it's precisely the pursuit of profit and the ability to raise money and drown out competitors and to build infrastructures that continuously create new asymmetries of power to shut down suppliers, vendors,
based
customers.
On options much earlier also in the society.
All inherited from prior rounds of struggle. All inherited from, this is precisely the idea of a historically specific trajectory where a given power distribution as to the question of which technologies get selected and in which institutional configurations reflects a society's inherited power structure based on its own history of prior rounds of this same thing happening. And so, you know, I spent 25 years ago, all I was writing about was open source software and open wireless and how technology actually made it possible for the first time, at least since the middle of the 19th century, to have a fully radically decentralized production system where the most important inputs into the most advanced economic activities, computers, sensors, were widely distributed in the population. We could have had Wi-Fi networks that we rolled our own last mile. The technology was there in 2000 to have end-to-end Wi-Fi circles. The entire LAMP stack, the fundamental architecture of the net and then the web, was built on open source software. That is to say, software that was written by communities of volunteers, structurally licensed in ways that prevented it from being enclosed, and you could build on it, but then you couldn't enclose what you build on it. That was the promise 25 years ago. They ended up being enveloped by the smartphone that wouldn't run open source software, by the cloud, by the shift to, by constraint of Wi-Fi and the shift to networks. So there's a constant competition where enterprises that can actually enclose and capture and extract profit are able to attract finance.
So going now from the micro to the macro, historically, the underlying argument which I was trying to develop is that petty bourgeois, you would call capitalism, was defeated in the 19th century, in part because it failed to solve the problem of showing how it could deal with economies of scale and aggregate resources. And J.P. Morgan said he knew how to solve it. He solved it through big capital. And now I'm claiming the knowledge economy shows that that defeat was not necessarily permanent, but it opens other opportunities for organizing this.
On that, we agree. The defeat is not permanent, we agree. That the defeat is not permanent, we agree, and that there's room for different, that it's not destiny. There's a difference between recognizing what forces are pushing in a given direction,
yes, they're strong,
and saying that you can't set up counter forces and institutional frameworks by leveraging the power of the state, by mobilizing politically and economically
and then you
large
often discover
populations.
that to solve one problem, you have to solve another. That as you go up to the limit, and then you describe that something else is limiting you, like the cult of the Constitution, the nature of the political institutions.
Absolutely. And again, the Constitution was itself a document introduced by property owners, partly to constrain the risk of non-property owners, in addition to at least partially preserving slavery. And the judges, the justices on the court at the time were part of a program that saw the solution to the post-Civil War crisis of capital as consolidation, and the fear of socialism and the rise of labor mobilization partly is what drove their pushback against. And that's the tail end of that court that ends up pushing back on Roosevelt. I mean, I don't need to tell you that, but I can tell you that. So things we agree on. At least I don't see us disagreeing. There's no deterministic one path to capitalism. We don't agree on use of the word capitalism in that sentence. There is no...
Let me explain, by the way, to the class why we don't agree on that. I think that what has happened on the left is that Marx's theory of society and history was the consummate achievement of European social theory, and but no one believes now in its central propositions. So what are its central propositions? The first is that there's a limited menu of systems: slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. The second is that each of them is indivisible. So that leads to a binary idea of politics, which is politics is of two kinds. It's either the reformist management of one of these indivisible systems, or it's the substitution of one system by another, revolutionary. That's not how structural change happens in history. Real structural change is always fragmentary. It doesn't take that fanciful systemic form, which is the fantastical limiting case. And the third proposition of Marxist social theory is that there are laws governing the operation of each of these systems and their foreordained succession in history. Therefore, we should not have a project because history has a project in store for us. So in general, I think no one believes in these propositions, but they continue using determinately the words of the system, which had meaning in that theoretical context, but have no clear meaning outside of it. I think that leads to self-deception and confusion.
I think lacking a theory of what the core driving dynamics that have led to the patterns we've seen and the repeated marginalization and defeat of meaningful alternatives leaves one unable to target one's transformation.
Not at all. Not at all. I think it's quite obvious. I just don't see the contribution of the theoretical stuff to the elucidation of the political options. What have we gained by putting these labels on them?
Again, I tried to be very precise in what I mean by capitalism. It's clearly not what Marxism, what any Marxist would look at and say, yes, this is Marxism.
So give us a succinct definition of capitalism. What is capitalism?
Capitalism is the form of social life that develops when you have near universal market dependence for subsistence, production, and protection as the dominant form of each in that society.
So I think that the definition to which Marx himself was most attracted is that capitalism is the regime under which labor is bought and sold.
I know, and I don't think that's enough and that's productive enough.
And now there have been, the main entities in world history are these agrarian bureaucratic empires. The Han Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and so forth. All of them faced these periodic collapses of market order, the demonetization of the economy when they fell apart politically and a barter economy replaced the market economy. Same phenomenon. And the imperial reformers in each of those empires were concerned above all to maintain the independent proprietors and workers who would be the source of taxes and of soldiers. Exactly the dynamic that you described in an earlier stage. But nothing has been gained by calling that not capitalist or capitalist. It's essentially the same dynamic. There were market orders. The difference between Europe and those empires is that in those empires the market order collapsed periodically, whereas in Europe it passed a certain threshold beyond which it could no longer collapse. The fundamental problem was the same. The imperial center was strong only when it could protect itself against the land-grabbing magnates and maintain the openness of its channel to taxes and to soldiers. This is not a new phenomenon that began in the 18th century or pushing it back into the 16th century. This is what it's always been. But I don't see what we gain by proclaiming under a different theoretical label the obvious, that it's fortunate to have in one's hands the assets that make people depend on you. That's what people have thought forever.
First of all, when you have a society in which most people have direct access to the means of subsistence, whether it's imperial, whether it's as in China under equal division, whether it's those people, whether it's early modern absolutist France as well, up until the middle of 19th century, arguably until de Gaulle. What you have is large population whose primary focus is on subsistence security, with or without additional markets as opportunities next to them. When you have those, you're not in a capitalist society. France doesn't become capitalist until 2.5 centuries after England.
It's like a cultural definition of capitalism.
No, it's not a cultural definition. It's a question of organization of production, and dependence on.
I don't understand that at all. France is a country that must be, by the economists, judged a failure because it's done everything against what they preach. It's a successful, quote, capitalist economy. Very successful, more successful than Britain in vital respects. So its culture is a culture that's hostile to Anglo-American entrepreneurialism. Fortunately for it, it's done quite well by that.
Much more recent, and I suspect some of the French would disagree with the characterization. But again, then we have to understand, so actually let's take that instead of, I'm in an awkward position here because I have lots to say about proto-capitalism and its interfaces and symbiotic relation with the various Mongolian khanates in the new book that I'm coming out with, as well as the interaction of proto-capitalist Islamic merchants with Song China. So let's not go there. I don't want to take us on a tangent that I would have a lot of fun with, but I'm not sure anyone else.
I think you're in an awkward position also because you admire European social democracy.
I plead guilty.
Yes, I know.
I plead guilty. You know what? I look at countries and I see,
yes, of course.
I see a bunch of countries that ends up being higher productivity growth, higher intergenerational mobility, higher marks on every measure of democratic index you have, higher equality, higher educational attainment. All things considered, I could think of worse places to start to look for good solutions.
Of course, but not as a good launching pad for humanity for its next adventure.
Let's start with saying that if we could turn Mississippi, much less Malawi, into Denmark, we'd be way ahead of where we are.
Really? Are you sure?
I'm convinced.
Have you considered the religions of the Swedes and compared it to the American religion? It's more complicated.
No, I have not considered the religion. And why is that what matters?
Everything matters in social life.
And so how do you choose what to focus on? Does everything really matter?
Yes, everything matters. How you choose to, you have to have a theory. But what I'm saying is that Marxist theory is a theory in which the left no longer believes, but it continues to use the words of the theory, and that's not in its interest.
At what stage usually in these do you tend to open up for people to...
We should have opened up a long time ago.
As you can tell, this is a course that's very much organized around Professor Unger's long-term thinking and the conversations around it and so we can sit here and have a lot of fun for many hours.
We should let stated propositions which are incendiary. Let's hear. Yes.
I have a question for Professor Unger.
Louder, please, so we can all hear.
Can you hear me?
There's a microphone right in front of you, so you can turn that on also. Well, here's the alternative. Here's
can you
the
hear me?
handheld.
Yes, now it's better.
Okay. I have a question, I guess, for Professor Unger. I wonder why, for you, the concept of the market dependence for subsistence is not an analytically useful concept for you. Because I think that for Professor Benker's theory, the market dependence for subsistence is central in analyzing the historically specific phenomenon that we are observing today in capitalist societies, where you have a constant self-expansion of exchange value. And that central dynamic of all modern societies is partially explained by somewhere along the line of historical development, we have this radical departure, and that is characterized by most people in that societies are separate from their means of subsistence, and that generates a specific dynamic that you don't see in prior societies. So I wonder why, I'm still not sure why, what's your pushback against the analytical usefulness of this concept?
There's no pushback. I think there's an underlying difference of intellectual intuition and sympathy. So Professor Benkler shares in the social democratic temperament, which wants to organize politics as a protection, a haven, or a series of havens against the market, against intellectual insecurity, against this or that. And I think that the haven is not enough. We want the storm, not just the haven, the storm of innovation, of creation, of construction. And so it begins in something very practical. In politics, if you simply represent the cause of protection of the haven, you lose. You lose at the outset, because those who command the agenda in politics are those who most credibly represent the cause of innovation, of creation, of novelty. Democracy is the perpetual creation of the new, and not just this protection operation that the Europeans emphasize. So I think that's the fundamental, the underlying temperamental difference.
I don't think it's a temperamental difference. I think it's an analytic difference.
It's an analytic difference, but
it's not temperamental, and let me just explain why.
Of course it's not just.
Because it's not standing on its own. The protection aspect is the question of socialization of continuous change. But continuous change, precisely innovation and continuous change, always necessarily disrupt existing ways of being and living.
And they're not opposed.
No, on the contrary. It is a precondition to being able to have dynamically stable social life, to also socialize the risk and cost and losses associated with continuous dislocation. And so the idea that a social democratic program is a program for protection and stasis, as opposed to a necessary component of actually socializing the cost of the process of a dynamic society.
We agree about that.
Okay.
We agree about that. That's the basic idea of fundamental rights
So
and endowments.
no rights and endowments, access to
Producing-
universal access to fulfillment of basic needs
Yes.
at a broad
No
level.
one is
So
against that.
you call that the
No,
protection from the market.
no,
That
no.
is to me
No,
the
because I think
foundational
that-
aspect of social democracy.
No, the emphasis in social democracy is on the creation of these havens. And it's fear of the market, fear of insecurity.
I think that's a mischaracterization of how these societies are organizing themselves. I don't think you can have a society that is described by the Heritage Foundation as more economically free than the United States by many, many, many lines, and say that it's all about protection from the market. But is the Heritage Foundation a lefty organization when they say that Denmark, Sweden, Norway are all more economically free than the United States, that it's easier to form a new business in Denmark than it is in the US? This is the Heritage Foundation is not a lefty Marxist organization.
This is not a running condemnation of Denmark. That's not the purpose.
But I'm saying actually something quite different. Or at least I will try as we progress across and try to give some evidence. Socializing the cost of continuous change is a precondition to making continuous change a politically sustainable project.
Of course.
That's what I mean by saying market dependence for subsistence. If you actually decommodify or partially decommodify access to basic needs and goods, then you can start a project of politically stable dynamics. You also need to socialize markets for labor, you need to socialize markets for credit, you need to socialize infrastructure, right? You can't have just freedom from want. You need to do it embedded by socializing markets for the basic means of production. If you want to get to a situation where you have
Yes.
people have the choice to be petty producers, hopefully at the cutting edge, but also to be wage laborers, but under conditions of cooperative high road strategies instead of exploitative low road strategies.
Yes.
That's the role of market dependence for subsistence in my analysis of capitalism. It's understanding that that foundation is what provides people with bargaining power in their relations with others. It's the freedom from the risk of destitution that makes people fearful of continuous change. And it's the need to assure that, not as a safety net that protects from the market, but as a precondition to making continuous change a politically sustainable social project.
Yes. I agree. We don't disagree about that.
That's
Good. The European social democracy is a very narrow embodiment of that project. Maybe you would agree with that also.
I think the term is too broad. I think it captures in it both the highly dualized and corporatist model of Germany.
So I think now changing the direction of the
Sure.
conversation, the project of the North Atlantic elites now, their main project, is reconciling the social protection of the Europeans with the economic flexibility of the Americans. That's been their historical project that has emerged in the period after the Second World War and is now temporarily obscured by the confusion in American politics. But that's the project. But the project does not take the broader form of creating a high-energy democracy that makes change less dependent on crisis, of democratizing the market order, of changing the direction of the evolution of technology. So it's an elitist project within a very narrow terms. That's my emphasis.
And
And we
not
have to
going
radicalize its point. But the point is that we should be both secure and heroic at the same time. But on what scale?
So here's where things that I think we do agree, not based on what you've said up till now, but what I know you've written. That we need a different set of institutions around access to credit, the investment in the direction of technology and knowledge, the institutionalization of continuous learning as a socialized project of continuous learning over life, in order to be able to be more productive and creative and work in meaningful ways that are consistent with our own sense of where we ought to go. All of these require much more than just the best of class, in my view, Nordic flexibility version of this, what you call the North Atlantic project of combining American flexibility with European protection. Much more than that. There are more things that need to go into making a better future. But I think that's the dimension in which we will agree on the core, though not on the specifics. There needs to be, it's not enough to have social protection. You need to actually socialize the core components of production in order to be able to shift to, as you say, you gave the example of the physician's assistants and AI, right? If you think of why general AI is attracting so much investment, it's precisely because its major developers are selling a vision of, we will be able to get rid of labor, and then you, the existing capitalist, and we, the developers of AI, can share the entire surplus that used to go to labor and leave it to somebody else to police them. That's the selling point behind which all of these trillions of dollars are going into the large data centers. It'll fail, and we can talk about why it'll fail, but let's bracket that for a moment. To get to the point where you're describing the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to actually create public AI in the way in which we create public roads or public railroads, high-speed railroads in places that have them and have 21st century railroad technology. So we're going to need to build the infrastructure as one that is actually separate from that. We're going to need to actually invest in public health systems that preferentially develop the technology and the training to actually make access to health far more widely accessible, and bring up essentially, train up essentially the people who today might be the clerical class workers into a position of paraprofessional, whether as independent producers or as part of public, nonprofit, or for-profit is a little harder. You're seeing today actually that private equity-based health services tend to squeeze things differently in terms of who does the work and how they do it and how much they do it. But all I'm saying is, to get to that, that's a vision that requires investment both in the technology and in the education and in the licensing change in order to make that possible. You have to have a vision of where you want to go, rather than worrying about where will the radiologists get their money from. None of that is going to happen on its own. It certainly isn't going to happen if you just leave things as they are in terms of where the investments will go. Certainly not in the United States, where we have the system that already is creating so much consolidation within private equity because of the difficulties of healthcare services, I mean, because of the difficulties of dealing with insurance and with the very concentrated medical supplies industry. So again, there I think we do agree. That was a very long conversation between the two of us in response to one question.
But who cares whether we agree or don't agree, right?
No, just trying to understand what's what.
No, but in a course in which there are two people arguing, like the two of us, I think there's a great risk and temptation for the students to think that the truth must be in the middle. But the fact is that it's far more probable that both of us are completely mistaken and that the truth is completely different.
No, that's just true for you. We've intimidated you all, or just exhausted you?
I have a bit of a clarifying question. So this goes to both professors. So my understanding is that Professor Benkler is saying that America should go towards European social democracy as a starting point to create possibilities for further, more radical transformation. I hope I'm getting that correct.
For more radical transformation.
So it's kind of like the small change that causes greater cumulative change. I hope that's correct. Professor Unger, if you disagree with that approach, do you envision a more radical, that's, again, a lot of things are being expressed in one word there, but a more radical shift first? Because you said that like we need to have the storm. You can't just create a haven in politics, in the policy, I guess.
I think that the meaning of a political event is determined always by what happens next. So it's the trajectory that matters. It's not how big your steps are at any one point. So there's no emphasis on this idea of revolution at the outset. The important thing is to have a direction, to mark a direction, and to select in the particular historical circumstance the initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. The rest is secondary.
I think we may be at time.
We're out of time?
I think we may be at time.
Okay, but I think that in the next class, we should discipline ourselves,
Why? It was so much fun.
open to it's fun for us, but
Yeah,
it's always fun for the one who's talking.
agreed.
Well, it was great fun, but it was not what we had planned.
Do you think they didn't learn?
No, I think it's useful.
I found it useful and interesting. And if you found it interesting and I found it interesting, it's useful for them. That's my guess. That's my sense. We got a lot on the table.
So next week's class, according to, at least to my understanding of the syllabus, was the focus is on where we're going to get the ideas from, and speak about these intellectual traditions, speak about the disciplines. I think rather than going directly into the discussion of the programmatic alternatives,
I think that's good.
position ourselves in the way